Ever get that feeling, when you're stuck in traffic or on a long commute, and you just wish you could use that time to learn something new? Well, what if I told you you could actually nourish your mind, even on the go?
Sounds pretty intriguing. What did you have in mind? We always hear about how the loudest voices are the ones that shape history, right? You know, the ones who shout the loudest and make the biggest demands. Well, what if I told you that some of the most important changes, like some huge victories, didn't come from these big booming voices?
Okay, I'm intrigued.
What if they came from some quiet ingenuity and a language that the enemy just couldn't understand? It really makes you think about where real power comes from, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. We always think about impact and volume together, but when you really look back at history, you see that a lot of the most important stuff came from unexpected skills and this really determined, almost quiet will to get things done.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dive into today. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers and how they helped the Allies win in the Pacific during World War II. Their story is all about how their culture, their heritage became this unbreakable code, like this brilliant military strategy that just shows you how powerful diversity can be.
And we get to learn all about it from Chester Nez's memoir, Code Talker. He was one of the original 29 Navajo men who came up with this amazing code. And his book isn't just about how the code worked, it's about his whole life, from growing up Navajo to the tough realities of war.
So today we're trying to understand how this small group of guys used their language and culture to have such a massive impact on this global conflict. It just doesn't seem possible, but they did it. How did they do it?
And as we hear about Chester Nez's experiences, it's good to remember that he's speaking for a whole generation of Navajos whose contributions haven't really been told.
So let's start at the very beginning, before the Pacific and the battles. Imagine Chester Nez as a young boy herding sheep on his grandmother's land in New Mexico. It was this huge, ancient landscape. And his connection to his people's traditions, that was his whole world back then.
Right. It was a world rooted in Navajo culture. Their relationship with the land was deep. Their spiritual beliefs were strong, like the idea of the right way, finding balance and harmony and everything. And Navajos also have this strong warrior tradition, a long history of protecting their people and their land.
But then everything changed. The government started these boarding schools and forced assimilation on the Navajo people. It's hard to believe, but they would punish these kids, harshly sometimes, for speaking Navajo. Chester himself remembers getting hit for speaking his own language. Can you believe that? The same language they were trying to make them forget ended up becoming their biggest strength.
It is ironic. These schools were trying to wipe out their culture, their language. But that's exactly what gave the U.S. military an advantage they didn't even realize they had.
Yeah.
It just shows you how ignoring and disrespecting different cultures can make you miss out on really valuable things.
Now fast forward to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Chester had never left Navajo land, had never even seen the ocean. But he felt this deep sense of duty and volunteered for the Marines. That tells you a lot about him and about the values of his culture.
Yeah, going from New Mexico to a troop ship headed for war must have been a huge shock. Think about how he must have felt, leaving everything he knew to go to a place he had never even seen.
Right. And remember this idea of the right way that the Navajos believe in. He must have been wondering how there could be any harmony in the middle of all that violence. But you know, the Navajo people have a history of being warriors, and that probably helped him through it.
I bet. It must have felt like two different worlds colliding.
Now, on that ship, something really important was happening. Chester and 12 other code talkers were working all the time, improving the code they had started developing back in the States. It wasn't just memorizing words, they were actually creating this whole secret military language, and they were picked specifically because they could speak both Navajo and English.
They were like a special unit within the Marines. They had the same uniform, same equipment, but their mission was completely different. And they knew how important it was they were creating a code from their language to help America win the war. That brought them together and made them really determined.
Chester actually talks about a chaplain blessing them before they got to Guadalcanal. He even says a prayer while holding his medicine bag that his father gave him. He prays for courage to be able to serve his country well and for protection, for that Navajo way of walking in beauty. It shows you how much their service meant to them personally and spiritually.
That's powerful. To be on the edge of battle, holding on to his heritage like that, and praying in his traditional way, it's like he was serving as both a Marine and a Navajo, carrying his whole culture with him.
And then they finally landed on Guadalcanal. The fighting there was nothing like their training. It was chaos. And it's interesting because the code talkers weren't in that first assault wave, the one that was super dangerous. It shows that the Marines knew how important their job was, and they wanted to protect them.
Yeah, Guadalcanal was a really important place. It was the first big attack the Allies made against the Japanese in the Pacific, the first step towards pushing back towards Japan itself. And by the time the Code Talkers got there in November 1942, there had already been a lot of fighting, heavy losses on both sides.
And that's where they sent the code talkers, right into the middle of that brutal fighting. They had to transmit messages while under enemy fire, while moving all the time in these crazy conditions. Chester talks about being exhausted all the time and how they all had to rely on each other to get through it.
It makes sense. Imagine trying to send and receive messages accurately when bullets are flying past your head and you're running for your life.
Right, and they were crucial. Before they got there, the Americans were sometimes accidentally firing on their own troops. But the code talkers could quickly and accurately give coordinates to the artillery and pilots. They brought a level of speed and clarity that just wasn't possible before.
So their communication really was a game changer.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the heart of it all.
Yeah.
This unbreakable code.
Yeah.
How did they make it work?
Well, they started with the 29 Navajos, the ones who were fluent in both Navajo and English. Their job was to make a whole new military language. And what they did was pretty clever. They used a double layer of encryption.
Double encryption. Sounds complicated.
It's simpler than it sounds. They took each letter in English and gave it an English word, usually an animal, plant, or something every day from their world. Then they translated that word into Navajo. So the Navajo word stood for the English letter in the code.
So it's like a secret code within a secret code. I think I'm starting to get it.
Yeah, exactly.
So give me an example.
Okay, so the letter A, they used the word ant, which in Navajo is walachi. B was bear, which is shush. C was cat, moisi in Navajo. D was deer, B. Simple but really effective.
Okay, I see. And why was this so hard to crack?
A few reasons. Navajo is a tonal language, which means that the way you say a word changes its meaning. It's totally different from English. A lot of the sounds are almost impossible for a non-Navajo speaker to even hear. Chester even says something like, "Do you hear Navajo?" to show how hard it is for outsiders. Then there's the grammar. It's really complex, especially the verbs, and it can express a lot of subtle meanings. It's not just a one-to-one substitution of words.
So you're saying it's more than just swapping out words?
Way more. Chester actually points out that Navajo is like painting pictures with words. For example, instead of saying, "I am hungry," they'd say, "Hunger is hurting me." It's beautiful, and it makes the code even more complex.
Wow. So the language itself is already complicated, and then they made it even more difficult to crack.
Yeah, and they kept making it harder as the war went on. They'd use 2 or even 3 different Navajo words for each letter, and they came up with over 400 new terms for military stuff, like ranks and equipment and tactics. It was constantly evolving.
That's amazing. Imagine trying to break a code that's in a language you don't understand, and it keeps changing. It would be a nightmare.
Totally. And on top of that, the Code Talkers were working in some of the worst conditions imaginable. Chester talks about being seasick all the time, the crazy humidity, hardly any food, and the constant threat of being attacked.
It sounds awful, but they did it.
They did.
Yeah.
Their resilience is incredible. Chester tells stories about finding ways to laugh, even in the worst situations, and how they all became so close. Their shared culture and the fact that their work was so important brought them together.
And the code worked. They directed artillery fire, they coordinated troop movements, all this vital information that could win or lose battles. They even had this do-or-die plan. If they were ever captured and forced to transmit a message, they would put specific Navajo words in to warn the other Marines.
That's intense. Imagine that kind of pressure, knowing that your every word could mean life or death.
It's incredible. Chester also talks about how exhausting and emotionally draining it was to be constantly in danger, but they had to keep going because their communications were so important. It really makes you think about the strength they had to keep going under that pressure. It makes you wonder what they must have been thinking about and feeling during these times. I mean, resources like Mindful Moments, that AI audiobook analysis YouTube channel, they really help you think more deeply about communication, about resilience, about different ways of seeing things. Like in Chester Nez's story.
Absolutely. These stories are more than just facts and dates. They're about how humans can endure and be creative in the face of incredible challenges.
Yeah.
And their work wasn't just on Guadalcanal, right?
No, they were all over the Pacific. Bougainville, Guam, all of these major battles, they were there, providing a clear line of communication. And sadly, Chester tells about the time another code talker, Harry Sosi, was killed by friendly fire. Just awful. It's a reminder of how dangerous it was for them, no matter where they were.
Oh, man, that's terrible.
It is. And there's this other story from Angkor where a U.S. medic almost shot Chester and another code talker, Francis, because he thought they were Japanese soldiers. It really shows how much fear and paranoia there was during the war, and maybe how little people knew about the different cultures fighting for America.
Wow, so they were in danger even from their own side. But you can't argue with their results. Their code worked, and it saved lives.
You're right. It was a huge advantage for the Allies. It probably saved countless American lives and helped them win faster. When they finally took Guam, the Japanese surrendered right when some high-ranking officers arrived. That just shows how important secure communication was.
And get this, their mission was top secret for 23 years after the war ended. Think about that. They kept quiet about what they did for over 2 decades.
Wow. They must have had so much to say, but they couldn't.
Right. And it wasn't until 2000, with the Honoring the Navajo Code Talkers Act, that they finally got the recognition they deserved. The original 29 were given gold medals, and the others got silver medals. It was a long time coming, but they finally got the respect they had earned.
It's amazing. After that, Chester became a real voice for the code talkers. He traveled all over telling their story. There's even this story about him blessing the Boston Red Sox, and that same year, they broke their 86-year losing streak. It's a great story, and it shows how their legacy lives on.
86 years. It's a long time to wait.
I know, right? But Chester's reflections on his life, how he experienced all these different cultures, and how his life took all these unexpected turns, it's really powerful. Their story is a tribute to how strong Navajo culture is, how clever they were, and how much they loved their country, even after all the injustice they had faced.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About all the other times in history when people have done amazing things quietly, behind the scenes, contributions that have shaped our world, but we might not even know about them.
That's such an important point. The Code Talker story teaches us to look beyond what's obvious, to see that real impact can come from anyone, anywhere. It reminds us that sometimes the quietest voices make the biggest difference.
Couldn't agree more. And if you're as fascinated by the Navajo Code Talkers as we are, we encourage you to keep learning about them.
Yeah, if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive and tell your friends about this episode. Share it with anyone who loves history and stories about courage and ingenuity.
And if you want to learn even more about Chester Nez's experiences, there's a link in the show notes where you can buy his memoir, Code Talker. It's an amazing read.
And one last thing, as you go about your day, think about the power of communication, the strength that comes from diversity, and the importance of remembering those hidden stories that have made the world what it is today.
Well said.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.